Thanks so much, Joseph. One of the former moderators of our church, whose name is fortunately erased from my memory bank, used to begin every single address by saying, "I'd like to say a few words before I speak." And I've always thought that was a helpful way to begin, and so I too would like to say a few words before I speak. And my first word is one of gratitude, appreciation for the invitation to be with you today. The second word is very important. I'm going to be talking about a particular journey that's a critical part of my past and my present. And it's a journey that's related to the colonization of North America by migrants from Europe and the devastating results for the original inhabitants of this continent as a result, and in particular about residential schools. I want to say that the story of colonization and the story of residential schools is a story most importantly told by Indigenous peoples and by survivors of those schools. And so it's important for me to say that my story is, in the light of your current theme of hospitality, not the story of a host, but rather the story of a guest. And I want to stress that because we constantly live at risk of appropriating the voice of others, particularly others who, until recent times, have been denied voice. And so I think that's a very important point to make before I begin. Let's have a moment of prayer together. Gracious God, may the meditations of our hearts and the words of my mouth be acceptable unto you this day. Amen. Jesus says to his disciples, "The yoke, the burden, is light." I want to talk this morning about the way in which, through the memory of the ancestors, through our precious scriptures, and most importantly, through the witness of Indigenous peoples, that yoke does indeed become light and indeed a source of life itself. I begin in the year 2000. As a matter of fact, it's almost exactly 19 years ago because it was February of 2000 when a group of bureaucrats from Ottawa and church bureaucrats from Toronto and Vancouver gathered in the high school in Hazelton, British Columbia, in the heart of the Gitxsan Nation, to meet with members of that nation and with survivors of a residential school outside of Alberta in St. Albert, close to Edmonton. The purpose of our gathering was to create an alternate dispute resolution process with a group of 29 survivors, a process that would take us away from litigation over all of the things that had happened in the schools. When we gathered, there was a lot of nervousness in the room, partly because we didn't know each other. It was the first time I had met those who would become close colleagues from the federal government. And even though I was much more familiar with the church folk in the Gitxsan Nation, because of course the Gitxsan Nation was traditionally missionized by the Methodist Church. And so there is a long historic connection between the United Church and the Gitxsan Nation. Even though I knew a lot of the people in that room, we had just come through a horrendous 2.5-year trial, a trial that's become known as the Blackwater Trial, in which survivors, not of the Edmonton School, but rather of the Port Alberni School, sued both the federal government and the United Church of Canada. And it was a trial that created a lot of bitterness because litigation was the worst possible way to seek right relations. We all know that in examination and cross-examination, re-victimization is so easily done. Those who are familiar with the history of that trial know also that a great deal of the time in the courtroom was spent with the United Church and the federal government arguing with each other over who was more responsible for the school system, while survivors of that system sat on the sidelines. So it was not a good time to be seeking reconciliation and right relations. But we also came with another part of history, because the United Church in the 1990s had given support to the Gitxsan Nation in their land claims issues, particularly with regard to a court case known as Delgamuth, a case that was settled by the Supreme Court of Canada in favor of the Gitxsan. As a matter of fact, David Ewart, who's here with us today, was one of the leaders in the campaign to raise monies for support of those very land claims. So the history is mixed. We came with that legacy as well. But it's still tough. As we met, there was an elder, a Gitxsan elder, who, when things became particularly contentious, would stop the meeting and he'd say, "Friends, we need to pray." And so we'd have moments of prayer. And the meeting would continue. And at another point, when things seemed to be stalled, he would again say, "Let's stop and let's pray." During a lunch break, I spoke to one of my colleagues from the United Church, and I said, "Do you know, if it had just been ourselves and the federal government meeting to try and arrange this alternate dispute resolution process, would we have suggested stopping the meeting for prayer?" He said, "Well, of course not. We understand the separation of church and state. We know there's a sacred realm and a profane realm. The two don't mix at all. We would never have done that." Well, the meeting continued, and there was more prayer from this Gitxsan elder. And finally, toward the end of the day, once again he called for a pause. And he was about to start to pray when he looked across the room at me and he said, "It is good to pray. It's good to ask the Creator to be present with us at this time. But what's the problem here? I tell you what the problem is here. We've been doing all the praying. What's wrong with you church people? Don't you know how to pray?" Well, we prayed. However, it didn't end there. The next day, after the Gitxsan prayed and after the church, being goaded into it, began to pray freely, this same elder, toward the end of our time together, stood and said, looking at a lawyer from Justice Canada, "We've accomplished something here today, and we've done it through prayer. And we finally got the church to pray too. What's wrong with you, Government of Canada? Do you not know how to pray?" And I felt for my colleague from Justice Canada, because I knew this wasn't in his job description. And yet, to his credit, he did manage to offer a kind of "to whom it may concern" prayer. As I was going from the meeting, and it was a beautiful, any of you who've been in the Bulkley Valley know how magnificent creation is in that part of the world. The mountains are not at a distance, they're right surrounding you. And this happened to be a clear night. And I was driving to my motel, and all of a sudden, in that starlit night, with the silence of the mountains surrounding me, I suddenly remembered Thessalonians 5:17. Pray without ceasing. Rejoice always. Do you remember that? It's fascinating because that's a part of my history. It's a part of the scriptures which inform my faith. But it was an indigenous elder praying in Gitsanamux, the language of the Gitsan, a language which I didn't understand, but in another way did. It was that elder praying out of his tradition that opened me up once again to my own. You see, that's the whole point of the seeking of right relations with Indigenous people. It's not the kind of burden we imagine it to be. In the years that I've met with congregations and talked about the residential school system, there are two responses that are so common. The first is denial. Oh, it couldn't have been that bad. After all, the intentions were good. The other, and it's sometimes more common, is a kind of incapacitating guilt. Oh, this is a burden too great. I can't right the wrongs of generations. I don't have the strength, I don't have the power, I'm just overcome by guilt about the effect of colonization on this land. It's too much. A singularly unhelpful response, because it fails to recognize that when we listen, when we're hosted by the other, the burden becomes light. Because in the encounter, we go into the depths of what is true in our own tradition, in our own selves, and suddenly that which seemed impossible becomes possible. There are so many other examples of this, and we may get into more of those in the conversation. I remember when we interviewed in our process, our alternate process, survivors of that Edmonton school. They began telling us the story of the older brothers. The older brothers. These were older children in the school who were very conscious of the fact that in that school there was a sexual predator. And he preyed particularly on younger children. He was a bit of a coward in some ways because when children got old enough and resisted, he would back off. But they were so conscious of how vulnerable their younger brothers were in that context. And so when they saw this individual going toward one of the youngers, they would deliberately intervene. And this became such an important strategy that they even formed their own club around it, calling themselves the Older Brothers. This is years and years later. These older brothers are now men in their 60s and 70s. But the pride they felt in telling that story was so evident because in that context of that institution, they were able to do something. And who in the institution, other than the older brothers, was seeking protection? Was it the government officials? No. They were consumed in administration. Was it the church chaplain? We had a chaplain in that school. But the problem is, that chaplain was the predator. He was arrested in 1961. And so it lay with vulnerable young children only a little older than the intended victims to be the saving force. And as I heard the story, Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan came to mind. And I realized that in that moment, that parable was being enacted in the memory of those survivors. There's another story. Another man who came bitter and angry at the church and at the government of Canada for everything that had happened to him. And in our process, we gathered in a circle. It was very unlike a courtroom. And our questions were questions of inquiry rather than questions of cross-examination. In that room, we talked. We gave him all the time he needed to tell his story. And we agreed on compensation. Never adequate, but at least something. After we had finished, and we had ceremony, we had prayer. After we had finished, the Indigenous psychologist who was a part of our group in this process offered Tony a ride home. And when he came back, he said, it was quite amazing. Tony came into this room very angry. When I took him back, he was silent for a while. And then he finally said, I never thought I'd have the chance to tell my story and be believed. It's incredible. But then he said something else. He said, I was just getting to know those guys, and I'll probably never see them again. And as the psychologist told us this, we reflected on the fact that his experience with the Indian agent and with the missionaries was common to most Indigenous people rooted in the land. The Indian agent would come and then go. The missionary would come and then go. And we would do the same. But there was another message in there, and that message was relationship. That in the midst of everything that had happened, the offer was being given of relationship. An incredible moment. Final story. After 4 years, this was a long process. This alternate dispute resolution process took 4 years. And there was a gathering, an annual gathering on the site of the Edmonton Residential School, a school that had burned down in the early 90s. Every Labor Day weekend they would gather. And on the gathering, as our time together was coming to a close, one of my federal colleagues and I were invited to join the Gitxsan in this weekend. And we went. And the weekend was filled with ceremony, with storytelling. And in the midst of it, I remember being in a tent one night, and Cree elders were praying, and their voices were overlapping in Cree. And as their voices overlapped, I suddenly began to feel myself in the same context as in synagogue, when the rabbis are chanting and their voices overlap. And later, after the prayer, we shared tobacco, and we were each given a little tobacco to take with us. And as the tobacco went round the circle, we cupped our hands to receive the tobacco, like we would receive in an Anglican congregation or in a Roman Catholic congregation, the host, the communion. And finally, an 8-year-old girl prayed in Cree and prayed for the memory of those who had gone, the ancestors. And Hebrews 12:11, surrounded are we by a great cloud of witnesses. It was all there. I was reminded of what our former moderator, Stan McKay, himself a Cree man, a survivor of the Birtle Indian Residential School in Manitoba. What he often said was one of the most difficult and painful things about going to the Birtle School as a 6-year-old Cree boy was that no one there seemed interested or ready to receive the gifts that he might offer as a Cree boy. And what I have learned over this journey is that those gifts still exist. Those gifts are still there for us. And that is where the burden, the yoke, is lifted. I conclude with one final remembrance from this time, and that was at the end of our time on Labor Day weekend in Edmonton at the site of that school when we did a circle dance. A circle dance, you know, is a kind of rhythmic dance where you move slowly in circle and you keep moving. It doesn't seem to ever have an end. It's as if you're in the rhythm, the heartbeat of creation, and it will never end. And in the midst of the circle, every so often, in acknowledgement of the uniqueness of human community, a nation would be called forward. The Blackfoot, come in and do your dance. And they'd come into the center of the circle and do their distinctive dance. The Blood, come in. The Nishka, come in. The Gitsan, come in. It was incredible. And as we were circling around, one of the elders suddenly said, as if by inspiration, "United Church of Canada, come in." Now, I had about 30 seconds to devise a United Church of Canada dance. And given that I've grown up in Saskatchewan, it did have a little country feel to it, a kind of schottische or a two-step. But given my age, there were also moves that were somewhat reminiscent of John Travolta. It worked. But the message was, the quest for right relations continues and grows and is always there. And it's not because we are inviting it. It's because those who have lived on this land since time immemorial are inviting us in and hosting us at the dance. And for that we give God thanks. Amen.
So when Jesus came to the temple and there were a bunch of people selling in the court of the Gentiles, he kind of lost his